It was a blistering Monday morning when I stood watching the sprinkler heads in my garden sputter and die mid-spray, the pitiful hiss of wasted pressure breaking the morning stillness. Within minutes, the once vibrant stretch of my vegetable patch wilted under the harsh sun, drooping like soldiers surrendering to an unseen enemy. Hose in hand, blinking against the brightness, I felt a sting of confusion crawling up my spine until my neighbor, Glenn, came running up my driveway, red-faced and breathless, clutching a crumpled letter. "Dylan, Manthe cut your water." "The HOA, they shut it off." Glenn wheezed, waving the paper like it was on fire. I snatched the letter, my eyes scanning the smug words printed at the top, stamped with threats and fines. But the real kicker, the part that sent a slow burn of fury right through me, was that I wasn't even part of their HOA. Not on their roster, not under their rules. I didn't pay their dues, didn't follow their bylaws. But they'd cut my line anyway. And they had no idea what they had just done. The line they severed wasn't just watering my tomatoes. It was feeding their precious fountains, their sparkling pools, their lush, uniformed front yards that won them Best Community awards year after year. By the time they figured out their mistake, I planned to be standing atop a throne built from the ruins of their green, thirsty empire. Honestly, the sheer pettiness of it made me laugh out loud right there in my front yard. It was so absurd, so deliciously stupid, it almost deserved applause. Without wasting another second, I stomped toward the old tool shed where the main water line branched out from the private well tucked deep into the woods at the back of my property. The well, a relic from long before the subdivision was even a blueprint, had been secured with rights I inherited when I purchased the land. Back when the developers rolled in with big promises and bigger wallets, they struck deals with the original landowners for water rights, linking their new subdivision directly into the private well system. The arrangement had worked smoothly for years because it was designed that way. But they didn't need them. And now they'd pulled the pin on a grenade they didn't even know they were holding. The knock at my door wasn't just aggressive, it rattled the whole frame. When I opened it, there stood Madison Gree, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, face pinched so tight it looked like she could chew coal into diamonds. Without so much as a greeting, she shoved a notice toward me. Violation. Trespassing. Unauthorized water use. Non-compliance with HOA landscaping guidelines, she spat like she was reading from a script. I stared at the paper, then at her, and back at the paper again. The nerve of it all might have been funny if it weren't so insulting. I let the silence stretch until even Madison's plastic smile started to falter. "You do realize," I said slowly, "I'm not a member of your HOA? I never signed anything. I don't answer to you." Her left eye twitched, but she pressed on, droning about community standards and border compliance. I watched her dig herself deeper with every self-important word, nodding occasionally like a priest letting a sinner confess their own damnation. When she finally paused for breath, I simply said, "You've made a huge mistake." But Madison wasn't the type to back down. She doubled down instead, claiming that because my property shared a border with their subdivision, I was somehow obligated to join. The logic was so broken it could have tripped over its own feet. What Madison didn't know, what no one in their little HOA club seemed to understand, was that the well belonged to me outright. Every gallon they drank, every blade of grass they watered, every fountain they ran was courtesy of my goodwill. And goodwill has limits. When she stormed off, promising legal action, I dug out my copy of the deed and the original water rights contract. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The ink faded in places, but the language was ironclad. I traced the infrastructure lines on the attached map and smiled. Their entire community's water system ran off my private well. They had no backup, no alternative supply. I could have shut them off right then and there. But where's the fun in that? Instead, I called for an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They showed up in their best khakis and pastel polos, Madison leading the charge like a general parading into battle. Clipboard in hand, she barely let me speak before launching into accusations: water theft, damage to community property, hostile conduct. I let them vent, stacking one baseless charge on top of the other like a teetering Jenga tower, until they ran out of steam. Then, without a word, I slid the original contracts across the table. Silence. Madison's hand trembled as she flipped through the pages. I pointed to the key clauses: private water source, limited access by fee agreement only, non-HOA jurisdiction. Without my consent, they had no right to a single drop. Their mouths worked like fish stranded on a dock. "You cut the supply line," I told them calmly. which makes you guilty of vandalism and tampering with a legal utility. I am fully within my rights to turn off the water indefinitely. Starting now. Madison's face drained of color as reality slammed into her like a truck. I didn't wait for her to respond. I stood, gathered my papers, and walked out while they sputtered behind me. That evening, I turned the shut-off valve at my well. One click. One quiet final sound. Their kingdom of green was about to turn to dust. The next morning, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching the chaos unfold. Sprinklers hissed air and wheezed out defeat. Lawns yellowed faster than I expected. The HOA office phones rang off the hook as residents demanded answers. It didn't take long for the first angry knock at Madison's door. The golf course browned by the second day. The community pool turned green by the third. The fountains dried to cracked stone monuments by the end of the week. The HOA's so-called paradise was rotting from the inside out, and all I had to do was sit back and watch. But Madison wasn't ready to admit defeat. She dug in her heels, called in plumbers, engineers, even legal counsel. They scrambled for solutions, hoping to reconnect their system or find an alternative source. Every option was either illegal, prohibitively expensive, or impossible within any reasonable time frame. Meanwhile, homeowners banded together against the board. Furious emails, petitions, demands for Madison's resignation flooded the HOA office. A reporter caught wind of the scandal, and soon cameras were rolling, broadcasting the downfall of their once-envied subdivision. The lawsuit I filed against the HOA for vandalism and breach of contract was the final nail in their coffin. The evidence was airtight: trail cam footage of their unauthorized dig, timestamps, documentation. Madison's attempt to reroute the supply line under the cover of darkness made the news cycle and sealed her fate. The HOA imploded. Madison resigned in disgrace. The remaining board members scattered. Residents voted to dissolve the HOA entirely, replacing it with a voluntary association stripped of any real power. In the aftermath, I bought up the common spaces at auction. The parks, the clubhouse, the fountains. Not to spite them, but to ensure they'd never abuse power like that again. The land stayed, but the rules changed. If they wanted access, they'd play by my terms. No more bullying. No more arrogance. Just clear boundaries, respect, and peace. And every morning, as I watered my thriving garden and sipped my coffee, I smiled knowing that all it took to topple their empire was a little patience and the quiet power of owning the well. It was a blistering Monday morning when I stood watching the sprinkler heads in my garden sputter and die mid-spray, the pitiful hiss of wasted pressure breaking the morning stillness. Within minutes, the once vibrant stretch of my vegetable patch wilted under the harsh sun, drooping like soldiers surrendering to an unseen enemy. Hose in hand, blinking against the brightness, I felt a sting of confusion crawling up my spine until my neighbor, Glenn, came running up my driveway, red-faced and breathless, clutching a crumpled letter. "Dylan, Manthe, cut your water." The HOA, they shut it off. Glenn wheezed, waving the paper like it was on fire. I snatched the letter, my eyes scanning the smug words printed at the top, stamped with threats and fines. But the real kicker, the part that sent a slow burn of fury right through me, was that I wasn't even part of their HOA. Not on their roster, not under their rules. I didn't pay their dues, didn't follow their bylaws. But they'd cut my line anyway. And they had no idea what they